Hey guys, welcome back. I know it's been a little while, just been kind of busy with some home renovations and some other life events, so finally back. And today we'll be continuing on with Chapter 5. So, Chapter 5, Winning at Trade. Myth number 5. The trade deficit means America is losing. Reality. America's trade deficit is its, quote, stuff surplus. I remember watching Donald Trump battle his way through the Republican primary debates with my son, Bradley, who was just 9 years old at the time. It was 2015, and Trump was blustering on about trade, complaining that countries like Mexico, China, and Japan were ripping us off and vowing to bring an end to the thievery of voters. The thievery if voters would put him in the White House. It became a central theme of his campaign. We are losing the trade war against foreigners. Quote, we don't win anymore. Trump thundered during a 2015 primary debate in Cleveland, Ohio, quote, we don't beat China in trade. We don't beat Japan with their millions and millions of cars coming in this country in trade. It's a message that resonates with millions of Americans, especially in states like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, where many voters trace the hollowing out of their communities and the loss of good-paying jobs to import competition and rising trade deficits. As president, Trump remained obsessed with the gap in imports and exports. That is, America's trade deficit with the rest of the world. To him, the trade deficit is prima facie evidence that America is losing at trade. On the one hand, he sees the losses in monetary terms, tweeting, quote, the United States has been losing for many years, $600 to $800 billion a year on trade. With China, we lose $500 billion. Sorry, we're not going to be doing that anymore. End quote. The problem, he seems to believe, is that foreigners are running off with our money. When he looks at the real terms of trade, the actual goods that are being traded between Americans and foreigners, he again sees America getting the raw end of the deal. In exchange for the millions of cars Japan is sending us, Trump explained in August 2019, quote, we send them wheat. Wheat. That's not a good deal. At that point, my son Bradley, then 13, turned to me with a puzzled look and said, quote, so, the problem is that we take their cars and they only take our wheat. That would be like me giving Ian 2 of my low-value trading cards and getting 10 of his high-value cards in exchange. I would be very happy with that deal. Viewed from this perspective, you could say that a country, quote, wins by maximizing its benefits, imports, and minimizing its costs, exports. But that would imply, counterintuitively, that America's roughly $700 billion trade deficit is evidence that the United States is already winning a trade. Could this be right? Does Trump have it completely backward? Well, instead of using tariffs to wage a trade war aimed at reducing the volume of goods coming into the United States from China and elsewhere, should the U.S. be trying to run even bigger trade deficits? Would that make us the undisputed global trade champion? As we'll see below, it's much more complicated than the simple black and white of winning and losing at trade. So why do many Americans feel like everyone is, quote, killing us when it comes to trade? In a word, jobs. As Richard Trumka, the leader of the largest federation of unions, explained to Trump just 1 week before his inauguration, bad trade deals have cost millions of Americans their good-paying union jobs. Quote, entire communities have lost their purpose and identity. He told the president-elect, and we have to fix that. He vowed to support Trump's commitment to renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and other deals, saying, quote, working people are looking for a new way forward on trade. Uncle Sam, by the ankles. Just like many workers in America, millions of workers in China, Japan, and elsewhere depend on their jobs for their livelihoods. Demand for the things that they help to produce suddenly dries up. Their jobs could disappear. That's why we often hear politicians and unions urging consumers to buy American or pressing companies like Ford or Apple to manufacture more of their products in the United States. when Americans spend money buying things that are produced abroad. That demand supports jobs in other parts of the world, instead of sustaining jobs here at home. Since 1994, when President Clinton signed NAFTA, ushering in a new era of, quote, free trade, life has gone steadily worse for millions of Americans, as industrial corporations have relocated their production centers to Mexico and eventually to countries beyond North America, where they could pay workers even lower wages. Millions of good-paying union jobs have disappeared. China's full ascension into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001 wreaked similar havoc on the U.S. working class. Economists at the Economic Policy Institute have concluded that China's demand for U.S. exports may have supported 538,000 American jobs from 2001 to 2011. But Chinese imports into the U.S. could cost more than 3.2 million Americans their jobs, for a net loss of about 2.7 million jobs. On top of that, to the extent those displaced workers were able to find new employment, the new jobs paid an average of 22.6% less than what they were earning before. This kind of trade-driven displacement has gutted entire regions where manufacturing was the economic lifeblood of large numbers of communities. It has also forced great swaths of Americans into permanent involuntary unemployment or a sinister cycle of low-wage service jobs. And that's something that I've come to notice when I've done political volunteer work, or even just driving around different neighborhoods. You see that, like in Ohio, Pennsylvania, like Wisconsin too. These were industrial powerhouses of America. The steel workers, you had the auto industry, like Detroit, for example, right? This is where these big corporations were. But once NAFTA, TPP were signed in CAFTA, all these industries left. And these industrial communities were decimated. People had to go to low-wage jobs making probably less than $8 or $9 an hour at the time. Even now, the wages are stagnant as hell and they haven't gone up at all. Certain states have raised it, of course, but you can see how many people were devastated when they lost their jobs. And with the lowering rate of unionizations and people not in a job where your wage will increase over time, it's ruined millions of lives. And that's why she's stating in here kind of how it happened. And it came against a backdrop in which neighborhoods and towns were already profoundly disrupted a decade earlier by corporate farm consolidation. By that she means, like Purdue Farms and Tyson and shit like that. They're the big factory farms, which is what she's referring to. These communities would go on to be pummeled again during the following decade via the China-related WTO trade shocks, during which many of the heralded consumer benefits of expanded trade with Beijing came with substantial adjustment costs, and many regional labor markets in which the industry is exposed to newly expanded competition from China were concentrated. Years later, the Great Recession of 2008 would deal another lethal round of job losses. By the time Trump came into town in 2016, his fear-mongering about migrants and scaremongering about the trade deficit found a receptive audience among workers already besieged by one economic calamity after another. Consequently, for many of these workers, there was seemingly nothing to lose by embracing Trump's call to arms, win a trade, bring jobs home, and make America great again. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party mounted a tone-deaf response. Hillary Clinton's campaign marketed blue baseball caps bearing the slogan, "America is already great." Perhaps Secretary Clinton felt boxed into a corner, and so her campaign adopted a strategy largely ignoring the voters who'd been crushed by America's trade relationships and the cumulative miseries associated with them, rather than laying out a compelling plan to restore good-paying jobs and help struggling communities. Top Democrats simply gave up on many working-class voters. For example, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer argued, quote, "For every blue-collar Democrat we lose in western Pennsylvania, we will pick up 2 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin." It was a losing strategy for the Democratic Party. And as you can tell, It failed epically. Having won the election in 2016, Trump has continued to stick with the message that the U.S. is locked in a losing competition when it comes to trade. Even some of his presumptive opponents echoed those sentiments. Senator Bernie Sanders, for example, has tweeted, quote, "It's wrong to pretend that China isn't one of our major economic competitors. When we are in the White House, we will win that competition by fixing our trade policies," end quote. Certainly Sanders aimed, and still aims, to fix trade policy by protecting workers and the environment. Yet there is a tinge of anxiety that progressives share with conservatives, fear of the trade deficit itself. The truth is, a trade deficit is not in and of itself something to fear. America doesn't need to zero out its trade deficit to protect jobs and rebuild communities. As long as the federal government stands ready to use its fiscal capacity to maintain full employment at home, there is no reason to resort to a trade war. Instead, we can envision a new world trade order that works better, not for corporations seeking to exploit cheap labor and escape regulations, but for millions of workers who've received such a raw deal under previous free trade policies and the post-NAFTA era. Re-envisioning trade also can lead to better policies for developing countries and for the global environment. 3 buckets. One way to think about the trade imbalances is to add a third bucket to the model we used in the last chapter. Previously, we put Uncle Sam in one bucket and everyone else in the other. Whenever Uncle Sam spent dollars, there was only one place for them to go, and to a collective bucket we called the non-government sector. That was a perfectly reasonable way to illustrate the fact that Uncle Sam's deficits poured dollars into our bucket. Now it's time to look more closely at the non-governmental bucket. Since this chapter is about international trade, we want to see how dollars flow between the U.S. economy and the rest of the world. To do that, we need to split the non-government bucket into 2 separate buckets. When we do this, we end up with a 3-bucket model. We have the U.S. government bucket, and now we have a bucket that belongs to all households and businesses, i.e. the domestic private sector bucket, along with one that belongs to the rest of the world, i.e. the foreign sector bucket. As before, it's impossible for all of the buckets to be in surplus or in deficit. At the same time, if there's red ink in one bucket, there must be black ink in at least one other bucket. As Godly told me, quote, "Everything must come from somewhere and then go somewhere." For every payment that flows out of one bucket, a payment of equal size must be received in at least one other bucket. As a matter of accounting, that means that the balance across all 3 buckets must always sum to 0. And here is Exhibit 8, in which he's talking about the buckets and how it's all split and organized. Just to give us a little illustration of what she's talking about and help you picture in your mind instead of trying to not be able to see it. So, that was Exhibit 8, the 3-sector accounting identity. So, in the real world, dollars flow among the 3 buckets every day. If the U.S. government buys some bulldozers from Caterpillar Incorporated and hires some American workers to build a bridge, dollars will flow into the U.S. private sector bucket as the government makes those payments. American workers and most U.S. businesses also pay federal taxes. So Uncle Sam subtracts some of those dollars away from the private sector bucket. To keep it simple, suppose as before that Uncle Sam spends $100 and taxes $90 away, leaving behind a surplus of $10 in the private sector bucket. Those dollars can spin around the U.S. private sector, changing hands as Americans pay for haircuts, theater tickets, college tuition. They can also switch between buckets as Americans import products from abroad. Let's say Americans spend $5 buying goods and services from the rest of the world, while foreigners just spend $3 buying products from the United States. By importing more than exports, the U.S. is running a trade deficit. When all is said and done, the U.S. trade deficit transfers $2 into the foreign sector bucket. Exhibit 9, which I'll put on display below. nets all of these payments out, showing that the U.S. government's fiscal deficit, minus $10, is exactly balanced by the sum of the surpluses and the other two buckets, 8 plus 2. As long as the U.S. economy remains at full employment, there is no inherent problem with this outcome. And here is Exhibit 9. Again, to give you guys a picture of the illustration and so you guys can better understand what she's talking about. And always feel free to jot this stuff down if you want, or even to take a picture of it to keep in mind. So, since Uncle Sam is the issuer of the dollar, he never has to worry about running low. His bucket can manufacture dollars at will, but everyone else has to get to the currency from somewhere. And the U.S. private sector normally wants to accumulate more dollars than it spends. That is, to be in surplus. That's not to say that the private sector can't fall into deficit. It can, as it did during the late 1990s and early 2000s. But as godly warned, that's usually an unsustainable situation, because it often involves the private sector taking on too much debt. Remember, the private sector isn't a currency issuer, so it can't sustain deficits the way Uncle Sam can. To keep the U.S. private sector from falling into deficit, someone needs to supply that bucket with enough dollars to keep it in surplus. Right now, that, quote, someone is Uncle Sam. That's because the U.S. runs persistent trade deficits, aka stuffed surpluses, which causes dollars to flow out of the private sector's bucket and into the foreign bucket. As long as that remains the case, only Uncle Sam can supply enough dollars to keep the private sector in surplus. To do that, the government must run budget deficits that exceed the U.S. trade deficit. Exhibit 10 shows what happens if the government deficits become smaller than the trade deficit. And again, to put this diagram on display, here is Exhibit 10. So in this example, the government has almost balanced its budget, but not quite. Uncle Sam is running a small deficit, spending $100 in the U.S. economy and taxing 99 back out. As a result, his deficit adds just $1 to the U.S. private sector bucket, but the U.S. is sending that dollar and 4 more onto the rest of the world, and foreigners are only sending $3 back. So the U.S. is running a trade deficit, spending $5 on goods and services produced by the rest of the world, but only collecting $3 for the things it sells abroad. Looking at all three payments, the foreign sector accumulates a $2 surplus, while the government and the private sector each end up with a $1 deficit. A private sector deficit is the inevitable consequence of allowing the government deficit to fall below the trade deficit. What would it take to return the private sector to its usual state of surplus? One option is for Uncle Sam to add more dollars to the private sector's bucket, either by spending more dollars in the U.S. economy or taxing fewer dollars away. As soon as the government deficit gets bigger than the trade deficit, the private sector's financial balance will move back into surplus. Another way to eliminate the private sector's deficit is to try to shrink or reverse the trade deficit. There are a number of ways to try to do this. Sometimes countries try to hold down the value of their currencies to make their goods more competitive on world markets. President Trump has routinely lashed out at China, accusing the Chinese government of manipulating its currency. The yuan to gain an advantage over U.S. producers in December 2019. He accused Brazil and Argentina of, quote, presiding over a massive devaluation of their currencies, which is not good for our farmers. Some countries don't have the option to weaken their currencies. 19 countries in Europe, for example, have formed a currency union, the Economic and Monetary Union of EMU, making it impossible to alter the value of their currencies vis-a-vis one another. €1 equals €1 throughout the Eurozone. When an external, i.e. currency, devaluation isn't an option, countries often pursue internal devaluation as a way to try to, quote, win at trade. The neoliberal term of art for this particular strategy is structural reform. It's the polite way of describing an agenda aimed at driving down labor costs. wages, and pensions. To increase competitiveness by reducing the cost of production, essentially it means that a currency uses weaker labor that a country uses weaker labor as a substitute for a weaker currency. When it comes to this strategy, Germany is Europe's poster child. After the German government committed to this strategy in the early 2000s, it was able to replace its long-standing trade deficits with massive trade surpluses. The thinking behind Trump's policy was to use tariffs, i.e., tax on imports, to reduce the trade deficit by making certain foreign goods more expensive. Trump believes he is pursuing an American-first strategy that will result in American consumers buying fewer imports and spending more money buying domestically produced goods. That would mean fewer dollars leaving the U.S. private sector bucket and flowing into the foreign bucket. Trump sees that as, quote, winning, because his entire worldview is shaped by cash flows. The one with the biggest bucket of money wins. MMT recognizes the importance of maintaining healthy financial balances, but views the tariffs as largely full employment and trade wars are no longer necessary to prevent. That's the wrong page. Views as counterproductive. That's because MMT recognizes that imports are real benefits. Viewed this way, Trump's tariffs are really a tax on U.S. benefits. There are better ways to maintain a healthy balance in the private sector and, as we'll see, better ways to protect American jobs.